The Pioneer by P.J. Blakey-Novis. I always knew they were out there. I think that most of us did. It seemed pretty unlikely that we'd be alone in the universe, but it still felt like fantasy to actually make contact. I'd always held out some hope that, should we ever encounter a species from beyond the stars, they'd be friendly. Surely we would have a wealth of knowledge to learn from one another. Maybe we could even create a trade agreement with these other beings, something mutually beneficial. Perhaps I was too optimistic in those days. Maybe the thought of war with an alien race was too terrifying to contemplate. The reality, however, was far worse. It was the year 2130, and I'd been working the lowly role of ship's cook aboard the starship Pioneer for almost 20 Earth years. The vessel was a research ship, primarily, staffed by a team of scientists with a crew of medics, engineers, soldiers, navigators, cooks and cleaners to support them. Despite being heavily funded by a multi-country initiative, the Pioneer was never expected to return to Earth. The technology was in place to transmit any discoveries back to the command center, and all aboard fully accepted that this was not a return voyage. The Pioneer was the fastest and most well-equipped vessel ever created. It was capable of travelling further than humankind had ever gone before, and despite a lengthy list of subjects to study, there was always that one underlying goal: to prove the existence of extraterrestrial life, even make contact with it. In 2111, when we had first set off, there was an excited buzz aboard the Pioneer. The belief that the scientists would succeed in their mission was strong, but it came with a nervousness. There was no guarantee what obstacles we would face or what danger we would be heading into. The presence of the small team of soldiers should have been a comfort, but it had the opposite effect on me. Guns in space were a stupid idea, and I saw these men as just trigger-happy grunts, more likely to start a conflict than prevent one. Almost 20 years on, and they had let themselves go to the point that they wouldn't be much use against an attack anyway. The time had taken its toll on the majority of the crew, myself included. Boredom had set in much earlier than I had anticipated. The first few years involved a group of us working our way through the hundreds of books and movies stored in the library, playing each and every board game multiple times, and even sharing beds with one another, simply for something to do. Most of us were single, or we wouldn't have agreed to a one-way trip into space, and those few that were married when we left knew there was no point keeping those vows now. After a few more years, it seemed as though everyone had had enough of each other, or at least had run out of things to talk about. People barely spoke, taking care of their jobs in silence, running on autopilot. Fights would break out on occasion, as the pressure of being trapped aboard this metal coffin became too much. 2 of the crew took their own lives. Excitement and a sense of adventure had been replaced with a feeling of hopelessness, and the low mood was contagious. Even new discoveries that the scientists made, while interesting to begin with, soon lost their appeal. So what if they had discovered a new element within a piece of space rock? Who cares that their equipment picked up traces of water in a planet's atmosphere? 20 years ago, those discoveries would have been huge. Now, even the researchers didn't seem to care. This attitude changed in 2030. This discovery got everyone's attention, tearing apart the boredom and filling the Pioneer with something else. Excitement? Nervousness? Fear? You see, I'm not a scientific man. Although I understand the possible implications of discovering water on an alien planet, that in itself doesn't excite me. However, when the research team called an emergency meeting of all personnel, they had something far more interesting to say. I'd switched off the cooker that I'd been slaving over the past few hours and shuffled along the brightly lit corridors to the meeting room. The room was designed to accommodate all the crew at one time, but it still felt crowded, perhaps because we'd not all been in there together for more than a year. I thought I'd have to feign interest as Reynolds, the lead researcher, began to speak, but the look on his face piqued my curiosity. Sweat coated the man's forehead, and he dabbed at it with a handkerchief. Glancing nervously at the rest of his team, Reynolds cleared his throat. He hadn't aged well, and I briefly thought back to when I first met the man. He must have been on the wrong side of 60 when we left, putting him in his mid-80s by now. I remember thinking it was optimistic of them to send anyone of his age on such a long mission, and was thankful that the rest of his team were at least 30 years his junior. Reynolds tried to speak, but the words were drowned out by the murmurs of the crew, and I watched as Veronica, his pretty in a nerdy way assistant, pulled a microphone from one of the cupboards and set it up for him. After a piercing screech of feedback, Reynolds managed to get everyone's attention. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice quivering with a combination of nerves and age. "As you may have guessed, we have made a discovery of sorts." I glanced around the faces of the crew, most displaying little or no interest, some even conveying annoyance at having been dragged to this meeting. "I hope it's better than some new type of rock," one of the cleaning crew piped up. There were a few laughs and nods of agreement. "I don't know if I'd say it's better," Reynolds replied, "but it could certainly be more interesting." The room fell silent as Reynolds continued. "A few hours ago, Mr. Stevenson, our chief navigator, spotted something unusual on the radars. Typically, this far into deep space, we only expect to see rocks and comets, and those are far and few between. What Mr. Stevenson spotted is something else." No one spoke. The crowd seemed to hold in a breath at the same time. Upon closer inspection, we saw that it was a piece of space junk, similar to the pieces of rockets or satellites which become damaged and float off into space. "So it's a bit of rubbish. There have been bits of junk floating around the Earth for well over 100 years. Could it not have floated out here with 100 years' head start?" one of the soldiers asked. "No," Reynolds replied, and I'm sure he was trying not to roll his eyes. "We're way too far from Earth for it to be man-made, which of course begs the question, where did it come from?" "What's the plan then?" the soldier continued. "I assume you want to bring it aboard." "I most certainly do," Reynolds replied. "A few of my team, however, have some reservations, so we thought it only fair to explain things in a bit more detail. Veronica, would you mind sharing your concerns?" Veronica pushed her chair back, causing an uncomfortable scraping sound to echo round the hall. She seemed to mutter a sorry before taking the microphone from Reynolds. "Hi, everyone," she began, her nervousness evident. Whether this was related to the discovery or speaking in front of a large crowd, I couldn't tell. "So, the item that has come to our attention appears to be around 6 feet in length, 2 feet in width, and cylindrical in shape. We've attempted to use our scanning equipment to see inside the item, but have had no luck. It appears that the outer material is simply too thick. We've also attempted to scan it for a heat signature, but there was not one. These are the standard procedures to determine whether something could be living within this item. Essentially, we've been unable to get a definite answer. There could be nothing in it." "Or it could be full of little green men and we wouldn't know until they're in the ship," the soldier stated. "In simple terms, you are correct," Reynolds replied to the soldier, taking the microphone from Veronica. "But we have procedures in place for this kind of event. The capsule would be brought aboard and placed in the isolation chamber. We could then carry out a wide range of tests from inside the laboratory, with no need for anyone to come into contact with it until we're certain that it was safe to do so. Of course, our security team would be there to assist, so I'm sure we'll all be perfectly safe." The soldier nodded, looking to the rest of his team for confirmation. "That's what we're here for," the soldier stated. "Just let us know what you need." "Do the rest of us get a say in this?" shouted the cleaner. "I mean, if your own team are scared of that thing, Then are we at least putting it to the vote? The question was greeted with some nodding heads and murmurs of agreement. There will be a vote, Veronica interjected, but not an individual one, as that would take too long. We want the heads of each department to have their say, so could those people stay and everyone else can return to your stations? This approach didn't seem to go down well with a few people, but on the whole I felt relieved not to have the responsibility of making a decision such as this. I returned to the kitchen and awaited the outcome of the discussion I was not deemed important enough to be a part of. Despite the decision not being unanimous, the majority agreed that the discovery was too important to not investigate further. Reynolds had been vocal in reminding everyone that should the capsule contain alien life, this had been their main goal when they left Earth, and it would mean wasting all these years if they ignored this development simply out of fear. For the first time in a long time, the Pioneer was buzzing with chatter and speculation. The lower-ranking crew members, such as myself, relied on gossip which had filtered down the chain to keep us updated as events unfolded. The capsule was brought through to the isolation chamber, so the main hall and rec rooms were much quieter in the evenings, as the cleaners, cooks and engineers spent their time staring at that metal tube through the viewing windows. Talk from inside the laboratory suggested that the scientists had been unable to identify the material and were still unable to ascertain the contents of the capsule. Word came 3 days later that they were going to attempt to open it. Fortunately for me, it was my day off, and I couldn't resist going to watch their efforts. It wasn't as though I had anything else to do anyway. I grabbed a coffee from the self-service machine in the canteen, just as Veronica was making herself a tea. "They're opening that thing up today, then?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Yep," she replied, the worry on her face unmistakable. "You don't think it's a good idea?" I asked, walking beside her as she headed back to the lab. "From a scientific point of view, it's absolutely the right thing to do. From a human perspective, it just doesn't feel safe. I mean, it could well be empty, but if it isn't, we have no way of knowing what will be in there and what it could be capable of." I nodded my understanding. "I'm going to hang out and watch if that's okay," I said, knowing that no one could tell me I couldn't watch from the viewing area. "It's my day off," I added, feeling as though I needed to justify why I was out of the kitchen. Veronica just nodded before she tapped her keycard against the door to the lab and disappeared inside. The attempts to open the capsule were far less interesting than I had hoped for. I watched Reynolds approach it with 3 different pieces of equipment, all emitting a high-intensity laser of a different colour, none of which left even a scratch on the shiny surface. Disgruntled and almost crying with frustration, Reynolds called it a night and closed down the lab, plunging the isolation chamber into darkness. I was awoken from my sleep a little after midnight when the sirens began to ring. Every corridor on the Pioneer was illuminated with a red flashing light as I climbed out of bed and opened the door to my small cabin. People ran back and forth in confusion before 2 soldiers appeared, urging everyone to return to their living quarters and lock the doors. Screams came from the far end of the corridor, and I hesitated. My eyes flitted between the perceived safety of my room to the sounds of terror not so far away, and I made a choice. Perhaps I could help, or perhaps I would die, but at least it wouldn't be boring. I walked the corridor slowly, trying my best to assess the upcoming situation. It was difficult to identify any other sounds over the blare of the sirens and the screams of the crew, but there was something else. A snapping sound, like bones breaking. I passed the laboratory and the viewing area for the isolation chamber, and stopped in my tracks. The capsule was no longer sealed. An impossibly dark opening had appeared in the top, and I stared at it as the red flashes of the warning lights dragged it from the darkness, a second at a time. I rounded the corner and slipped, falling to the floor. Everything was red. The lights, the floor, the walls. My feet were coated in the blood of someone, but it was now impossible to tell who they had been. Pieces of flesh were scattered about the corridor alongside torn lab coats and crimson ID badges. The walls were covered in blood spatter, and there was even some on the ceiling. Veronica had been right to be afraid of that thing. Just as I was about to make a run for my cabin, a series of 3 small flashes accompanied the sound of gunfire nearby, followed by an ear-splitting howl. The soldiers were nearby, and thankfully seemed to be doing their job. Had they killed whatever had come aboard? I ventured onward, keeping my eyes focused on the next turn in the corridor and away from the mess of body parts which littered the ground. Another gunshot. Another howl. The creature was still alive, but it was hurt at least. I turned the corner as I heard a sickening crunch. One of the soldiers, the last soldier, as I quickly discovered, was facing me, his feet dangling a foot off the ground. Holding him in place was what looked like the claw of a scorpion, only much larger, of course. It had pierced his chest from behind and was protruding from the front. I strained in the flashing red lighting to see more details, but could not take my eyes from the dying man's face, his mouth gurgling blood, his arms twitching in surrender. It was not until the creature let the soldier slide from the appendage that I could see what we were facing. I almost let out the most inappropriate of laughs as I surveyed the being that had caused so much destruction, for it looked like an overgrown mantis. Its large, almost perfectly triangular head featured bulbous eyes. Its body was thin, but appeared to be entirely made of muscle, supported by strong legs which were as long as the creature was tall. For arms, it had the deadly claws which were surprisingly similar to those of a scorpion, sharp, powerful, almost indestructible. Between the flashes of red light, the creature could not be seen, for the blackness of its exoskeleton was darker than anything I'd ever seen. Even when it was illuminated for those brief moments, it was as if it were merely a shadow of a monster standing among the debris of humankind. If the armed security team could not destroy this beast, then the whole ship was doomed, of that I had no doubt. But I still didn't want to go willingly to my death. I ran, or at least I tried to. The floor was slick with the gruesome remains of my fellow travellers, and I fell to the floor numerous times. I refused to look at whatever mess my hands landed in each time I hit the floor, choosing to concentrate on keeping ahead of the creature and the awful clicking sound it made. Soaked in blood, which was thankfully not my own, I came to a skid at the entrance of the meeting room. I tried the handle, finding it locked, as the clicking sound grew closer. I watched in terror as the 2 claw-like appendages appeared from around the corner, quickly followed by the rest of that abomination. It was no more than 6 feet away from me when I felt a hand grab me by the arm and yank me forward. Veronica had seen me approaching the meeting room, in which she had been hiding out with another of the science team, a man a little older than me, and well within the category of morbidly obese. She had taken a risk by unlocking the door and pulling me to safety, albeit temporary safety, and her colleague was clearly angered by my presence. He explained in hissed whispers how stupid Veronica had been, how it was now every man for himself, and so on. I thought, but had the decency not to say, that if the 3 of us were to be chased, then this chap would make our escape much easier, not to mention keeping that thing fed for some time. "It seems you were right," I whispered to Veronica. "I wish I hadn't been," she told me, her eyes tearing up. "Is there anyone else out there?" "I don't know," I replied. "Lots of people were locking themselves in their cabins, but the soldiers are all dead. They wounded that creature, but it's still fast. It's pretty horrific up by the lab." "So, what are we supposed to do?" asked the big guy. "If we can't kill it, then we're all going to die. We need to get guns." "If you feel like going back out there and searching for guns, in the dark, among the leftover pieces of the soldiers, you go ahead," I said, knowing it would be suicide. "Funny," he replied. "I think I'd rather we go to the ammo room." Veronica and I looked at each other in confusion. I thought the soldiers only carried a handgun each, so as not to run the risks that come with having a whole arsenal on the bloody spaceship, Veronica said. You really think they only had handguns? I heard them talking, before, about some high-tech bullets for some new rifles. One of the guys was complaining that they couldn't test them out. How come they didn't have them tonight, I asked. If they had better weapons, why not actually use them when they were needed? He's talking shit, Veronica said. Our best chance is to stay here and keep out of sight. Until when? Her colleague demanded. Until we starve? Until we're the last ones left. We just wait for a fucking alien to break in and kill us. We have to try something. And for the first time, I had to agree with the guy. He's right, I said, looking at Veronica as best I could in the darkness. But I'll go. You're safer in here for now, and you... I paused as I turned to face the huge man. You'll slow me down. Just tell me where this ammo store is. He didn't even try to go with me, and I wondered if sending me had been his plan all along. When I say ammo room, it's more of a cupboard than a room, I think. I've never actually seen it. I've just heard the guys talking about it a while ago, but I'm sure it's near the soldiers' quarters, and it won't say what it is on the door. Helpful, I replied, approaching the exit to the meeting room. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any more of that awful clicking, but heard nothing. In my head, I planned my route, knowing my best chance for survival was to get there quickly, and locked into the ammo room. If the creature followed, then so be it. At least I'd be armed. Open the door, run to the left, past my cabin, onto the lift, down one level, follow the corridor to the right. I'd only been past the soldiers' quarters once before and had laughed at how overly macho it had been. The rest of the Pioneer was immaculate, but those few cabins had been decorated like a teenage boy's bedroom, with posters of topless women holding ridiculously large guns, sports cars and military vehicles. I racked my brain to locate any other rooms along there, but came up short. Only one way to find out. I gave Veronica a curt nod as I gently opened the door, holding my breath as it let out a small creak. No sound, aside from the blare of the alarm, could be heard, so I stepped into the corridor. I glanced around, took a deep breath, and ran as fast as I could. The carnage was far less in this direction, leading me to believe that the monster had headed back to where I had met it, presumably to feast on what flesh remained. I reached the lift safely, hitting the call button and staring into the darkness from whence I'd come, expecting to see claws emerge from the shadows. Nothing came for me, not even the lift, which I presume was a safety protocol triggered by the alarms sounding. The stairwell was only a few feet further, so I reached it in a matter of seconds and began to descend the metal steps, my shoes clanging against them noisily. One floor meant 18 steps in 2 sections of 9. And when I reached the level I needed, a thought hit me. The shape of the creature's legs and its overall size made me question its ability to follow me down here. Perhaps that thing could be contained on one floor, at least for now. I hurried along, checking each door that I passed. Each of the soldiers' cabins were unlocked and uninhabited. At the far end, as the corridor turned to the right, there were 2 more doors. One was labelled as a cleaner's stockroom, presumably for mops, cleaning products, cloths and the like. The other just carried a warning of high voltage and a clear keep out sign. With no doubt in my mind, I pulled at the door, but it refused to budge. Of course it had been locked up securely, I thought, hardly daring to consider where the key would be kept. If it's not in the security chief's room, then it must have been on his person, and that's as good as lost. I quickly made my way through the cabins, trying to discover which belonged to the chief of security. I never found out which room was his, just as I never discovered the whereabouts of the key. And I never found out if that door really did lead to the ammo supply. So many unanswered questions. The one question that I now did have an answer to related to the creature's ability to manoeuvre itself downstairs. It stood at the foot of the stairwell, its impossible blackness a silhouette of terror in the dark, building up to a crescendo of clicking. I could try to run, but what was the point? We weren't getting into the weapons stash. We couldn't isolate this thing on one floor and just carry on our existence as though it wasn't there. For all I knew, I was the last human left on the Pioneer. Fear turned to relief as I faced that thing head on. I knew it was futile, but I no longer cared. That monster, that alien, brought with it an end to the boredom. Even so, I managed to smile at the knowledge we had succeeded in our mission. Even if that success was not quite as everyone had hoped. We had discovered the existence of extraterrestrial life, and I'm sure that Reynolds, especially at his age, died a happy man with this knowledge. I charged at the creature, intending to land blows on its bony exoskeleton, but I never made it that far. It stuck out one clawed limb just as I got close enough, and I felt it glide through my chest and tear free from my back. I felt, more than heard, the crack of my ribs as they shattered, and felt myself choking on the warm metallic blood which now flowed freely. I looked into the creature's eyes as it tilted its head, appearing to examine me. And then nothing but darkness. The Pioneer by P.J. Blakey-Novis. I always knew they were out there. I think that most of us did. It seemed pretty unlikely that we'd be alone in the universe, but it still felt like fantasy.